The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, cream-colored and heavy, bearing the embossed letterhead of Hartwell Morrison and Associates. I held it against the kitchen window, watching the October light filter through the paper, knowing that whatever lay inside would change everything. My hands, 68 years old and marked by decades of caring for others, trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Dear Mrs. Melania Momoa, we are pleased to inform you that you are the sole beneficiary of the estate of your late aunt, Ivana Momoa Fay. The inheritance includes liquid assets totaling $4.2 million, as well as property holdings in Vermont and Maine. I had to sit down. Aunt Ivana, my father's sister, who had moved to Boston 50 years ago and whom I'd seen perhaps twice in the past decade. We'd exchanged Christmas cards, brief phone calls on birthdays, but nothing more. She'd never married, never had children, and apparently she'd remembered me. The coffee grew cold in my hands as I read and reread the letter. $4.2 million in property investments. I thought of my cramped apartment in Portland, Oregon, thought of my part-time job at the library, the careful budgeting that stretched my Social Security check, the way I'd learned to make soup from leftover vegetables and men's sweaters instead of buying new ones. The irony wasn't lost on me. Just 3 weeks earlier, Dr. Reeves had delivered news that made money seem irrelevant. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe 8 if I was lucky. The kind of diagnosis that strips away everything except what truly matters. I set the letter on my small dining table and stared at it. In the space of 3 weeks, I'd gone from counting pennies to inheriting millions, and from planning my retirement years to planning my death. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. That evening, I called my lawyer, a kind man named Ryan Aniston. His voice carried genuine surprise and concern as he reviewed the documents I'd photographed and sent to his office. Melania, this is substantial. You'll need to make some decisions about estate planning, obviously. Have you thought about how you want to handle this with your children? My children? 3 biological children from my marriage to Leo. Christopher, 38, a successful contractor in Seattle. Olivia, 35, a marketing executive in San Francisco. And Mark, 32, a software engineer in Denver. And then there was Rachel, 29, whom Leo and I had adopted when she was 7, after her parents, Leo's brother and sister-in-law, died in a car accident. I haven't told them about the inheritance, I said quietly, or the diagnosis. There was a pause. Ryan Aniston was too professional to offer unsolicited advice, but I could hear the question in his silence. I want to see, I continued, who shows up when there's nothing to gain. After hanging up, I sat in my favorite chair, a worn velvet armchair that had been my mother's, and thought about my children. Christopher, who called every few months, usually, when he needed advice about his rocky marriage or wanted to complain about his teenage son. Olivia, who sent perfunctory texts on holidays and birthday cards ordered online, arriving precisely on time, but with messages written by strangers. Mark, the youngest of my biological children, who'd grown distant after college and now seemed to treat me like an obligation rather than a mother. And Rachel, sweet Rachel, with her dark eyes and fierce loyalty. She called every Sunday and visited every few months despite living in Sacramento, where she worked as a social worker. She remembered my birthday without Facebook reminders, knew I preferred tea to coffee, and had never once made me feel like a burden. I made my decision that night sitting in the darkness of my small living room. I would tell them about the diagnosis, but not the money. I would see who cared enough to visit, to spend time with a dying woman when there was nothing to inherit, except memories. The first call was to Christopher. His phone went to voicemail as it often did. Christopher's mom, I have some news I need to share with you. Call me when you get this. Olivia answered on the second ring, but I could hear the distraction in her voice, the click of computer keys in the background. Mom, is everything okay? I'm in a meeting. Can this wait? Olivia, I need to tell you something important. Been to the doctor. I paused, surprised by how difficult the words were to speak aloud. I have cancer. Advanced cancer. The doctors say I have about 6 months. The typing stopped. What? Mom, are you? I'm sorry. I can't. I need to call you back. This is just, I need to process this. She hung up before I could respond. Mark was kinder, asking questions about treatment options and expressing genuine shock. But when I mentioned that the doctors had said the cancer was too advanced for treatment, he grew quiet. Mom, this is a lot to take in. I'll call you tomorrow, okay? I need to talk to Sandra about maybe adjusting some travel plans. Rachel answered on the first ring as she always did when I called. Mama. She'd called me that since she was 7 years old, a little girl thrust into our family by tragedy. You sound upset. What's wrong? When I told her, she didn't hang up to process or promise to call back. She cried, real tears that I could hear through the phone, the kind of raw grief that comes from genuine love. I'm coming up this weekend, she said when she could speak again. I'm taking Monday off work. We need to talk about everything. Doctors, treatments, what you need, Rachel, sweetie. The doctors were very clear. There's nothing. I don't care what they said. I'm coming. You're not going through this alone. After I hung up, I sat in my chair until well past midnight, thinking about the difference between obligation and love, between duty and devotion. Tomorrow, I would begin the most important experiment of my life. I would discover which of my children loved the woman who had raised them and which loved only what they thought she might leave behind. In the morning, I would start giving away pieces of my life. Small things, meaningful things. I would watch their faces, listen to their words, measure their presence against their absence, and when the time came to reveal the inheritance, I would know exactly who deserved it. The envelope from the lawyers lay on my table, a gateway to a new kind of power. But the real power, I realized, was in the choice of silence. In the space between what was hidden and what was revealed, I would finally learn the truth about the people I'd spent my life loving. The clock chimed midnight, marking the beginning of my final test. Rachel arrived on Friday afternoon, 3 days after our phone call. I heard her key in the lock. I'd given her one years ago when she'd insisted on having a way to check on me during her visits. She didn't knock or call out. She simply appeared in my kitchen doorway, her dark hair windswept from the October rain, her eyes puffy from crying. She dropped her overnight bag and crossed the room in 3 quick steps, wrapping me in the kind of fierce hug that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this grieving 7-year-old all those years ago. Rachel hugged like she was trying to hold your soul in place. You've lost weight, she said, pulling back to study my face. When did you last eat a real meal? I eat plenty, I lied, though it was true that food had lost its appeal since the diagnosis. Everything tasted like cardboard now. She gave me a look that said she knew I was lying, but wouldn't argue yet. I brought groceries, real food, not that processed nonsense. And I'm cooking dinner. That was Rachel. While my biological children were still processing the news, she was already taking action, already planning how to care for me. She unpacked bags of fresh vegetables, whole grain bread, and the kind of organic chicken that costs twice what I usually paid. I started to protest, the expense, but she cut me off with a gentle but firm shake of her head. Don't, Mama, just don't. I watched her move around my kitchen with easy familiarity, finding the cutting board I kept behind the dish towels and locating my good knife in the drawer where it had sat unused for months. She chopped onions with swift, practiced strokes, and I found myself remembering her at 15, insisting on helping with Thanksgiving dinner, determined to master every recipe I was willing to teach her. Tell me about the doctors, she said without looking up from her work. Everything. Don't spare my feelings. So, I did. I told her about the weight loss I'd attributed to stress, the back pain I'd blamed on my mattress, and the fatigue I'd written off as getting older. I told her about Dr. Reeves's gentle voice as he explained the scans, the way he'd paused before using the word terminal, and the careful way he'd outlined what the next months would look like. Rachel listened without interrupting, her hands never stopping their rhythmic chopping. Only when I finished did she speak. What about second opinions, clinical trials? I've been researching, Rachel said. I reached across the counter and stilled her hands. I'm 68 years old. I've raised 4 children, buried my husband, and built a life I'm proud of. I'm not going to spend my last months being poisoned by chemicals that might give me a few extra weeks of misery. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. This was what I loved about Rachel. She heard what I was saying, not what she wished I was saying. My phone buzzed with a text message. Olivia, Mom, I'm so sorry about yesterday. This is just such a shock. I'm looking into flights for next weekend. Next weekend, 5 days after I told her I was dying. The others? Rachel asked, seeing my expression as I read the message. Olivia might visit next weekend. Christopher hasn't called back. Mark said he'd call yesterday, but... I shrugged. Rachel's jaw tightened, but she didn't say what I could see in her eyes. She'd never criticized her siblings. Not once in all the years she'd watched them treat family obligations like inconvenient appointments to be rescheduled. She turned back to the stove, stirring the soup she'd started with an intensity that suggested she was working through some strong emotions. What do you need from me? She asked finally. The question caught me off guard. Not what can I do or how can I help, but what do you need? As if my needs mattered more than her own discomfort, more than the disruption to her carefully planned life. I need to know that someone will remember me accurately, I said, surprised by my own honesty. Not as a saint or a martyr, but as I really was, stubborn and imperfect and human. She turned from the stove, wooden spoon still in her hand. Tell me stories, she said. Tell me everything you want me to remember. So I did, over dinner. Her soup was perfect, rich, and warming. I told her about my childhood in small-town Vermont, about meeting her father in college, about the early years of our marriage when we were broke but happy. I told her about the day each of my children was born, including the day she'd come to live with us. Scared and angry and speaking a mix of English and Spanish that made bedtime stories an adventure in translation, she listened with the focused attention of someone creating an archive, asking questions that showed she understood not just what I was saying, but what I meant. When I mentioned my regret about never finishing college, she nodded as if this explained something she'd always wondered about. When I talked about the loneliness, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Saturday morning brought a phone call from Christopher. Finally, Mom. Jesus, I'm so sorry. I've been in complete hell with this project, and Ashley found out about Megan. That's another story, and I just got your message yesterday. Cancer. How the hell did this happen? I explained again while Rachel quietly made breakfast in the background. Christopher interrupted frequently with suggestions about doctors he'd heard of, treatments he'd seen on the news. His friend whose father had beaten the odds with some experimental therapy in Mexico. Christopher, I said when he paused for breath, I need you to listen to me. The cancer is advanced. I've accepted that. What I need now is for my children to visit me while I'm still myself. Of course. Of course. This is so sudden. Look, I can probably get up there in a couple of weeks. This project should be wrapped up by then. And Ashley's got that thing with her mother. But after that, a couple of weeks. The words escaped before I could stop them. Mom, I know how this sounds, but I've got 20 guys depending on this job. And if we don't finish on time, the penalty clauses are going to kill us. You understand, right? You always understood about work. I did understand. I understood that his mother was dying, and he was scheduling her around construction deadlines and marital drama. I understood that a couple of weeks might be too late. I understood that Rachel was watching me with careful eyes, seeing exactly what I was seeing. "Of course," I said, my voice steady. "Work comes first." After I hung up, Rachel didn't ask what he'd said. She didn't need to. My face had apparently communicated everything necessary. "More coffee?" she asked gently. Sunday evening, as Rachel prepared to drive back to Sacramento, Olivia called. She wasn't coming next weekend after all. A last-minute work emergency. A presentation that couldn't be rescheduled. A client who was threatening to walk if she wasn't available. "I feel terrible about this, Mom. But you know how it is. I can't just drop everything, maybe the weekend after. Or I could fly up for a day just to see you. Would that work?" A day to see her dying mother. "That would be lovely, sweetheart," I said, watching Rachel load her overnight bag into her car through the kitchen window. After Olivia hung up, I stood at my window and watched Rachel check her tire pressure, a habit she'd developed after her adoptive father died in a car accident that might have been prevented by better maintenance. She was thorough in everything, careful, responsible. At 29, she was more mature than my other children had been at 40. She knocked on the door before leaving, though she still had her key, always considerate, always mindful of boundaries. "I'll call you tonight when I get home," she said, hugging me goodbye. "And I'll be back next Friday. I've already talked to my supervisor about working remotely for the next few weeks." "Rachel, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." Her voice was firm, brooking no argument. "You're my mother. This is what daughters do." After she left, I sat in my quiet apartment and thought about those words. This is what daughters do. As if love were a simple equation, a clear set of responsibilities. As if showing up for the people who had shown up for you was the most natural thing in the world. My phone remained silent. No calls from Mark, no follow-up from Christopher, no revised plans from Olivia, just the echo of Rachel's promise to call. When she got home safely, to return next Friday, to be present for whatever came next. I poured myself a glass of wine, a small luxury I'd allowed myself since the diagnosis, and opened my laptop. It was time to start making plans. Real plans, not the vague wishes I'd been carrying around since Dr. Reeves had delivered his verdict. I needed to update my will, arrange for Rachel's inheritance, and decide how to handle the revelation when it could no longer be avoided. But first, I would wait. I would see who came when death was the only thing on offer. I would measure love, not in words or promises, but in presence. And when the truth finally emerged about the money, about their priorities, about the difference between the child who had chosen our family and the children who had simply been born into it, I would be ready. The wine was bitter on my tongue, or perhaps that was just the taste of finally seeing clearly. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that would have been almost peaceful if not for the circumstances. Rachel kept her promise, arriving every Friday evening and staying through Sunday night. She converted my small spare room into a makeshift office, working remotely on her laptop while keeping me company, occasionally taking calls with clients who needed her expertise in family crisis intervention. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. During those quiet weekends, I began to understand that Rachel's love wasn't just emotional. It was practical, informed by her professional understanding of what people need when their world is falling apart. She researched my medications, organized my pill dispenser, and quietly rearranged my furniture to make navigation easier as my mobility declined. She never asked permission for these changes. She simply made them the way a daughter would. My biological children, meanwhile, remained tantalizingly absent, their good intentions scattered like leaves on the October wind. Christopher called twice more, both conversations dominated by his construction deadlines and marital problems. Olivia sent thoughtful text messages but couldn't seem to coordinate an actual visit. Mark had gone completely silent after his initial promise to call back. By early November, I made my first strategic move. I called each of them on a Wednesday when Rachel wasn't there to witness what I was about to do. The conversation with Christopher was typical. He was distracted, rushing between job sites, but he managed to squeeze in some sympathy between complaints about subcontractors. "Christopher," I said, cutting through his litany of work problems, "I've been thinking about Christmas, about what happens to my things when I'm gone." The line went quiet. Then, "Mom, you don't need to worry about that stuff now. You've got time, do I?" The doctors were very clear about the timeline. I think I need to start making some decisions. I could practically hear the mental calculations. "What kind of decisions?" "Well, there's the house Dad left me. I've been renting it out, but I own it free and clear. And there's my mother's jewelry, some family antiques. I know it's morbid to think about, but I want to make sure everything goes where it should." I didn't mention that the house had been sold 3 years ago to pay for Leo's cancer treatment, or that my mother's jewelry consisted of a wedding ring. I no longer wore a string of cultured pearls worth maybe $50, but Christopher didn't know that. "Look, Mom, maybe we should talk about this in person. I might be able to get up there next weekend after all. Let me check with the guys about the schedule." Suddenly, next weekend was possible. The conversation with Olivia followed a similar pattern. The mention of inheritance transformed her from too busy to visit to deeply concerned about my well-being. She could probably rearrange her presentation, she said. Family was more important than work, after all. Mark actually answered his phone this time, and when I brought up the subject of my estate, his voice took on a warmth I hadn't heard since he was in college and needed money for textbooks. "Mom, I've been meaning to visit. Sandra and I have been talking about making a trip up to Portland anyway. Maybe we could combine it with seeing you. Combine it as if visiting his dying mother were a convenient add-on to a weekend getaway." I hung up from that last call and sat staring at my phone, amazed by how quickly the prospect of inheritance had motivated them. 3 weeks of excuses had evaporated the moment money entered the conversation. I felt simultaneously vindicated and heartbroken. When Rachel arrived that Friday, she immediately noticed my mood. "You look tired," she said, setting down her bag and studying my face with the practiced eye of someone who worked with families in crisis. "More tired than usual." "What's happened?" I told her about the calls, about the sudden interest from her siblings, about the fictional inheritance that had accomplished what my diagnosis couldn't. She listened without comment, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. "They're all coming next weekend?" she asked when I finished. "All of them." Amazing how talk of money cleared their calendars. Rachel was quiet for a long moment, absently organizing the mail I'd left scattered on the kitchen counter. "Mama, can I ask you something?" "Of course. When Uncle Leo was sick before he died, you used to visit him every day at the hospital. Even though you had 4 kids at home and Dad was working double shifts, you never missed a day. He was family. And when Mrs. Aniston next door had her stroke, you brought her meals for 3 months. You helped her with her physical therapy exercises and drove her to doctor appointments. She was alone. She needed help. And when I was struggling in high school, when I thought I didn't belong anywhere, you came to every single soccer game, every school play, every parent conference. You never made me feel like I was different from the others. I saw where this was going. Rachel, I'm not trying to make this about me. I just want to understand something. You taught us that when people need you, you show up. That's what family means. So what does it say about them that they're only showing up now?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke. I'd been asking myself the same thing, but hearing it from Rachel made it impossible to ignore. "Maybe they're just scared," I said, though the words tasted like ash. "Maybe. Or maybe they're exactly who they've always been, and you're just now in a position to see it clearly." That Saturday, Rachel helped me prepare for the invasion. She cooked a large pot of chili, made cornbread, and set the table for 5. She was polite about the upcoming visits, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she moved through my apartment like she was preparing for battle. "Are you going to tell them?" she asked as we folded laundry together. "About the real inheritance?" I'd been wondering the same thing. The money sat in my account like a loaded weapon, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. I don't know, yet. I want to see what they do first. And if they disappoint you, then they'll learn something about consequences. Sunday evening arrived with the weight of an approaching storm. Rachel packed her bag with obvious reluctance, checking and double-checking that I had everything I needed for the week ahead. "Are you sure you don't want me to stay?" she asked for the third time. "I could take more time off work. You've done enough. More than enough." I hugged her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, storing up the memory. "I need to face them alone. Call me if you need anything. Promise me. I promise." After she left, I sat in my quiet apartment and made my final preparations. I updated my will on my laptop, leaving everything to Rachel except for symbolic amounts to my biological children, $1,000 each, enough to make the point without being cruel. I printed out copies of my medical records, the inheritance papers, and Rachel's adoption documents from 22 years ago. Then I waited. Christopher arrived first on Saturday morning, and I knew immediately that Rachel had been right. He moved through my apartment like an appraiser, his eyes cataloging furniture, artwork, anything that might have value. He hugged me peremptorily, asked after my health with distracted concern, then began steering the conversation toward practical matters. "So, Mom, about Dad's house? Is it still rented out? What's the monthly income on that?" I let him ask his questions, gave him vague answers, watched him calculate imaginary profits in his head. When Olivia arrived an hour later, she joined the dance, asking about insurance policies and investment accounts with barely concealed eagerness. Mark showed up with Sandra in the afternoon, and their performance was perhaps the most painful. They'd brought flowers and expensive chocolates, gestures that might have seemed thoughtful if not for the way Mark kept glancing around the apartment, clearly disappointed by its modest contents. "Mom, you're looking good," he lied smoothly. "Better than I expected." I'd lost 15 LABs and could barely walk to the mailbox without getting winded, but apparently I looked good enough to live longer than he'd hoped. We sat around my small dining table. The four of us crowded together in a mockery of family dinner. They talked about their lives, their jobs, their plans for the holidays, but their attention kept drifting to the envelope I'd placed on the side table, the inheritance papers, from the lawyer's position just obviously enough to be noticed. "What's that, Mom?" Olivia asked finally, nodding toward the envelope. I smiled, feeling a cold satisfaction settle in my chest like winter fog. Just some paperwork from my lawyer, nothing urgent, but their eyes kept returning to it like metal, filings drawn to a magnet. I could see the questions they wanted to ask, the calculations they were making, the assumptions that were building in their minds. As the evening wore on, their behavior became more obvious, more desperate. They began sharing memories, carefully chosen stories that cast them as devoted children, tales of holidays and birthdays that bore little resemblance to my actual experience of those events. They spoke over each other, competing for the position of most beloved child, most deserving heir. I listened to it all with growing amazement. These were my children, the people I'd raised, loved, sacrificed for, and they were performing for me like strangers, auditioning for a part in my life. Not one of them asked about my pain levels, my fears, or what I needed from them in my remaining months. They were too busy securing their positions in my will to care about my actual well-being. It was Mark who finally asked the question they'd all been circling around like vultures. "Mom, have you thought about, with the diagnosis and everything, have you made arrangements, updated your will?" The moment stretched between us, heavy with expectation. 3 faces turned toward me, waiting for the answer that would determine their level of future interest in my welfare. I looked at each of them in turn, these children I'd raised to be better than this, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. The last vestige of maternal protection, the instinct to shield them from consequences, finally died. "Yes," I said quietly, "I've made arrangements." The silence that followed, My words was electric. I watched my biological children exchange glances, their faces carefully composed, but their eyes bright with anticipation. Sandra shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with the naked greed she was witnessing. Even she seemed to understand. Something fundamental was happening, though she couldn't quite grasp what. "That's good, Mom," Christopher said, his voice artificially casual. "It's important to have things in order." "Very responsible," Olivia added, nodding sagely. "We should probably talk about the details. Make sure we understand your wishes." Mark leaned forward slightly. "Do you want to discuss it now, or would you prefer to handle it privately with each of us?" I almost laughed at their transparent maneuvering. In 3 hours, they'd gone from perfunctory concern to eager estate planning. If I'd had any doubts about their motivations, this conversation would have eliminated them. "Actually," I said, standing with deliberate slowness, "there's something I need to show you first." I walked to my bedroom, feeling their eyes follow me, and retrieved the manila folder I'd prepared. Inside were the real inheritance documents, the ones they knew nothing about, along with copies of Rachel's adoption papers and a printed timeline I'd created showing their visits over the past 2 years. I'd been meticulous in my recording, documenting every missed birthday, every canceled plan, every excuse. When I returned to the living room, they were whispering among themselves, but fell silent as I sat down. I placed the folder on the coffee table and looked at each of them in turn. "Before we discuss my will," I said, "I want to tell you about the last 8 weeks. About what it's been like since I received my diagnosis." Christopher shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, we know this has been hard." "Do you?" I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut through his platitudes. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you have no idea what the last 8 weeks have been like." I opened the folder and pulled out the timeline. "Let me refresh your memories. I called each of you on October 15th to tell you I had terminal cancer. Christopher, you took 5 days to call me back. Olivia, you hung up on me and took 3 days. Mark, you promised to call the next day and then went silent for 2 weeks." Their faces began to flush, but I wasn't finished. "In the 8 weeks since my diagnosis, Rachel has spent 16 weekends with me. She's driven up from Sacramento every Friday, taken care of my medical appointments, organized my medications, and made sure I'm eating properly. She's used all her vacation time and arranged to work remotely so she could be here when I need her." I pulled out another sheet of paper. "In those same 8 weeks, Christopher, you visited me once, today, after I mentioned my inheritance. Olivia, this is your first visit since last Christmas. Mark, you haven't been here since my birthday in June." The room was so quiet, I could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen. Sandra was staring at her hands, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. My children looked like students caught cheating on an exam. "But here's the interesting part," I continued, my voice growing colder. "The moment I mentioned my estate, all of you suddenly found time in your busy schedules. Amazing how money clarifies priorities." "Mom, that's not fair," Olivia protested. "We've all been dealing with our own stuff, work pressures, family obligations." I let the words hang in the air. "Yes, let's talk about those." I reached into the folder again and pulled out the inheritance documents. 3 weeks after my diagnosis, I received some unexpected news. My Aunt Ivana died and left me her estate, $4.2 million, plus property in Vermont and Maine. The sharp intake of breath was audible. Christopher's eyes widened. Olivia's mouth fell open, and Mark actually leaned back in his chair as if the number had physical weight. $4.2 million, Christopher repeated slowly. "Plus the properties," I confirmed. "Quite a substantial inheritance, wouldn't you say?" They were staring at me with a mixture of shock and calculation. I could practically see the wheels turning, the mental math being performed, the sudden realization of what was at stake. "Mom, that's incredible," Olivia said, her voice breathless. "What are you going to do with it all?" "Well, that depends," I said. calmly. You see, I've had 8 weeks to think about what I want my legacy to be. 8 weeks to observe how my children respond when their mother is dying. 8 weeks to see who shows up when there's nothing to gain but the privilege of spending time with someone they claim to love. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sandra was now actively avoiding eye contact with everyone, including her husband. My children, meanwhile, were beginning to understand that this conversation wasn't going the way they'd expected. Rachel doesn't know about the money, I continued. I haven't told her because I wanted to see who would care for me without the promise of financial reward. I wanted to know who loves Melania Momoa the person and who only loves Melania. Momoa the potential benefactor. Christopher found his voice first. Mom, this isn't fair. We do love you. We've just been overwhelmed. It's been a difficult time for all of us. Has it? I asked. Because Rachel manages to work full-time as a social worker, handle her own stress and responsibilities, and still show up every weekend. She's younger than any of you, makes less money, has her own life to worry about, but somehow she's managed to be here when I needed her. She doesn't have kids, Mark said defensively. She doesn't understand the pressures. She has 67 kids, I snapped. That's her current caseload. 67 children in crisis situations who depend on her professionally. And yet, she's managed to reorganize her entire life around my needs without a single complaint. I stood up again, feeling a surge of energy that surprised me. The anger was clarifying, burning away the fatigue and pain that had become my constant companions. You want to know what my will says? I'll tell you. Rachel gets everything. The inheritance, my personal effects, my insurance policy, all of it. You 3 get $1,000 each, and my hope that someday you'll understand why. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched their faces cycle through shock, anger, disbelief, and finally a kind of desperate calculation. Mom, you can't be serious, Olivia said, her voice tight. We're your children, your biological children. Biology isn't what makes a family, I replied. Love is. Presence is showing up when someone needs you, not when it's convenient or profitable. Christopher stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. This is insane. Rachel has manipulated you, turned you against your own family. Stop. My voice cut through his words like a blade. Don't you dare suggest that Rachel has manipulated me. She's the only one who's been here without expecting anything in return. She's the only one who's treated me like a mother instead of a bank account. But we're your real children, Mark said, his voice plaintive. We're family. I looked at him, this man I'd raised, loved, worried about for 32 years, and felt nothing but pity. Real children show up, Mark. Real family doesn't disappear when someone gets sick and reappear when money is mentioned. Sandra finally spoke, her voice barely audible. We should go. She was right. But none of them moved. They sat there staring at me as if I were a stranger, as if the woman who had raised them had been replaced by someone cold and calculating. In a way, perhaps I had been. Terminal illness has a way of stripping away pretense, revealing the bones of what really matters. You still have time, I said finally. I probably have a few months left. You could choose to spend those months being my children instead of my potential heirs. You could visit because you want to know me better. Share memories, help me through what's coming. You could act like the people I raised you to be. Olivia's eyes filled with tears, but they looked more like tears of frustration than grief. How can we do that now? How can we visit knowing you think so little of us? I think exactly as much of you as your actions have. Shown me to think, I replied. The question is whether you're willing to change those actions. Christopher shook his head, his jaw clenched. This is emotional blackmail. No, I said quietly. This is accountability. This is what consequences look like when you treat someone as disposable and then discover they're not. They left 20 minutes later, their goodbye hugs perfunctory and cold. I watched from my window as they stood beside their cars in my parking lot, arguing in heated whispers. Olivia was crying. Christopher was gesticulating angrily. Mark kept shaking his head as if he could make this entire conversation disappear. Finally, they drove away, leaving me alone with the echoes of 30 years of motherhood and the bitter knowledge that I had raised 3 children who saw me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I called Rachel that night. "How did it go?" she asked immediately, her voice tight with concern. "Exactly as you predicted," I said. They were more interested in my bank account than my health. There was a long pause. "I'm sorry, Mama. I know you hoped. I hoped for 30 years that they would become the people I raised them to be. But hope without evidence is just delusion. What happens now?" I looked around my quiet apartment at the photos on my mantle showing decades of birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings. In almost every picture, Rachel was there. Sometimes in the background, sometimes front and center, but always present, always smiling, always part of the family in ways that went deeper than blood. Now, I said, I spend my remaining time with the daughter who chose to love me. The weeks following my confrontation with my biological children took on a different quality, like the crisp clarity that follows a severe storm. There were no more pretenses to maintain, no more false hopes to nurture. I had spoken my truth, and now I could focus on what truly mattered, preparing Rachel for a life without me and savoring whatever time we had left. My children's response to my revelation was predictably varied. Christopher called twice. Both conversations were brief and strained, filled with accusations that Rachel had poisoned me against them and demands that I reconsider my rash decision. Olivia sent a series of increasingly desperate text messages, alternating between guilt-inducing reminders of their shared history and barely veiled threats about contesting the will. Mark, perhaps most tellingly, said nothing at all. Rachel, meanwhile, knew something had changed the moment she arrived that Friday evening. She found me in my kitchen making tea with steady hands and a lighter expression than I'd worn in weeks. "You told them," she said immediately. It wasn't a question. Everything. The inheritance, their behavior, my decision about the will. I poured hot water over the chamomile tea bags, inhaling the familiar, soothing scent. You should have seen their faces when I read them the timeline of their visits. Rachel sat down across from me, studying my expression with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read between the lines of family dynamics. "How do you feel?" It was such a simple question, but it stopped me cold. How did I feel? For weeks I'd been focused on anger, disappointment, the bitter satisfaction of finally holding my children accountable. But underneath all of that was something unexpected. Relief. "Free," I said. "Finally. For the first time in years, I feel free." She nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "You don't have to pretend anymore." Exactly. I don't have to pretend. Their neglect doesn't hurt, or make excuses for their absence, or hope they'll magically become the people I raised them to be. I sipped my tea, savoring its warmth. I can simply love the child who deserves it and stop wasting energy on those who don't. Over the next month, a curious thing happened. As my body grew weaker, the cancer was progressing exactly as Dr. Reeves had predicted. My spirit grew stronger. Rachel and I developed routines that felt less like caretaking and more like an extended conversation between two women who truly understood each other. She would arrive Friday evenings with groceries and stories from her work. Tales of families in crisis reminded us both how precious functional relationships really were. We cooked together when I felt strong enough, or she would cook while I supervised from my chair at the kitchen table, offering suggestions and sharing the recipes my mother had taught me decades ago. Saturdays became memory days. Rachel would bring her laptop, and we would go through photo albums, family videos, boxes of letters, and documents that told the story of our life together. She interviewed me like a journalist, asking detailed, questions about family history, recording stories I'd never thought to tell. She was creating an archive. I realized something to hold on to when I was gone. "Tell me about the day you and Dad decided to adopt me," she said one Saturday afternoon. In December, we were sitting through Christmas decorations, deciding which ones she should keep and which could be donated. I smiled, remembering. "We didn't decide. You decided for us." She looked up from the box of ornaments she was organizing. "What do you mean? Do you remember your first Christmas with us? You were 7. You'd been with us for about 4 months. You were still so angry, so sure we were going to send you away like everyone else had." Rachel nodded. She'd shared pieces of her early memories over the years, the foster homes, the uncertainty, the fear of getting attached. We were decorating the tree, and Christopher was complaining about having to hang ornaments. Olivia was more interested in her new Barbie dolls. Mark was too little to help much. "But you," I paused, remembering the intensity of that small, dark-haired girl who had watched everything with such careful attention. "You hung every ornament like it mattered, like you were claiming your place in our family, one decoration at a time." "I remember that," Rachel said softly. "I was terrified you'd change your minds." Your father and I looked at each other across that tree, and we both knew. You weren't a temporary placement anymore. You were ours, and we were yours. The paperwork was just making it official. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I never knew you realized that, sweetheart. We realized it the first week you were with us. The adoption was never in question. We just had to wait for you to believe it." These conversations became the foundation of our remaining time together. I told her about my childhood, my dreams that had been deferred or abandoned, my regrets and small triumphs. She shared her own memories, her perspective on growing up in our family, and her gratitude for the stability we'd provided after so much upheaval. In January, as winter settled deep into Portland and my strength began to fail more noticeably, Rachel made a decision that shouldn't have surprised me, but still took my breath away. "I'm taking a leave of absence from work," she announced one Friday evening. "I want to spend these last weeks with you full time." "Rachel, you can't sacrifice your career." "I'm not sacrificing anything," she said firmly. "I'm choosing what matters most. My supervisor understands. My colleagues understand. This is where I need to be." So, she moved into my spare room, transforming my small apartment into a place where life could be lived fully despite the shadow of death hanging over us. She arranged for hospice care, managed my medications with the precision of a trained professional, and somehow made my dying feel less like an ending and more like a completion. My biological children made sporadic attempts at reconciliation during those final weeks. Christopher showed up unannounced one Tuesday in January, apparently hoping to catch me in a moment of weakness. When Rachel wasn't there to influence me, he found me sitting in my favorite chair, wrapped in the quilt my mother had made, watching the snowfall outside my window. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice carefully modulated. "Maybe I haven't been as present as I should have been. Maybe we could start over." I looked at him. This man who shared my eyes and my stubborn chin, and felt a deep sadness that had nothing to do with my illness. "Christopher, do you love me?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Of course I love you. You're my mother." "Do you like me?" He frowned. "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one. Do you enjoy my company? Do you find me interesting? Would you choose to spend time with me if we weren't related?" The silence stretched between us like a canyon. His eyes darted around my apartment, looking anywhere but at my face. "I thought so," I said gently. "You love the idea of me, Christopher. You love the security of having a mother, the social expectation that families stay connected, but you don't actually like the woman I am. You never have. That's not true. When was the last time you asked me about something other than family logistics or your problems? When did you last want to know what I was reading or thinking about or hoping for? When did you last see me as a person rather than a role? He left shortly after that, and I never saw him again. Olivia tried a different approach, bringing photo albums and attempting to reminisce about happy family memories. But her stories had the hollow ring of someone trying to convince herself as much as me. She spoke about holidays and birthdays with the enthusiasm of someone describing a movie she'd seen once long ago. Mark never came at all. By early February, I was sleeping most of the day, eating very little, and finding it difficult to concentrate for long periods. But I was also experiencing something unexpected, a profound sense of peace. Rachel and I had said everything that needed to be said. I had loved completely and been loved in return. I had spoken my truth and accepted the consequences. On a Tuesday morning in mid-February, I woke up knowing it would be my last day with any real clarity. Rachel was sitting beside my bed reading a book, but she looked up immediately when I stirred. "Good morning, beautiful girl," I whispered. She smiled, but I could see the knowledge in her eyes. She understood the way she always understood. "I love you, Mama," she said simply. "I love you too, more than you'll ever know." I spent that day giving her my final gifts, the password to my bank accounts, the contact information for my lawyer, the location of important documents. But more than that, I gave her my blessing to live freely, to love fully, to build the life she deserved without the weight of guilt or obligation. "Promise me something," I said, as evening approached and my voice grew weaker. "Anything. Don't waste time trying to fix them. Your brothers and sister, they are who they are. You can't love them into being different." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "And Rachel, thank you for choosing us. Thank you for being exactly the daughter I needed." I died 3 days later on a Friday morning while Rachel held my hand. She told me later that my last words were, "Thank you for loving me." The funeral was small, but meaningful. Rachel arranged everything according to wishes I'd expressed months earlier. A few close friends came, some neighbors, colleagues from the library where I'd worked. My biological children attended, sitting together in the front row like a delegation of distant relatives paying respects to someone they'd barely known. Rachel read a eulogy that captured not just who I was, but who I had tried to be. She spoke about love as a choice rather than an obligation, about family as something built rather than simply inherited. She mentioned my biological children kindly but briefly, focusing instead on the relationship we had built together, the woman I had helped her become, and the legacy of unconditional love I was leaving behind. After the service, Christopher, Olivia, and Mark approached Rachel with stiff condolences and awkward questions about the estate. She handed each of them an envelope containing their $1,000 inheritance and a brief note I had written, explaining once more that love must be demonstrated, not assumed. They left soon after, and I suspect they rarely think of me now, except perhaps when they need someone to blame for their own emotional shortcomings. Rachel, meanwhile, used the inheritance to establish a foundation supporting aging adults who have been abandoned by their families. She continues her work as a social worker, but now she also advocates for elder rights and dignity. She visits my grave every Sunday, bringing fresh flowers and updates about her life. She married a kind man named Mark, different from my son, 2 years after I died. They're expecting their first child this fall. She's already decided that if it's a girl, they'll name her Melania. In the end, I got exactly what I'd hoped for, the chance to see clearly, to love purely, and to leave a legacy with someone who truly understood its value. The money was never the point. The point was discovering that real family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about showing up again and again with an open heart and genuine care. Rachel understood that from the moment she was 7 years old and hung Christmas ornaments, like she was claiming her place in our family. She's still claiming that place, still honoring what we built together, still proving that love, not biology, makes a family whole. I died knowing I had chosen well,